All right, welcome. Today we'll be talking about two different chapters from the AMSCO AP US History textbook, Chapter 9, which focuses on sectionalism, the different regions in the United States and kind of the regional differences, and then Chapter 11, which focuses on the reform movements. All of this is during the antebellum era. Ante means before, bellum means war. So this is the different American regions before the Civil War and the reform movements before the Civil War as well. Like always, I've set up my notes over here if you want to set it up as well. We'll talk about immigration in the 1800s, both Irish and Germans. Then we'll talk about each of the three regions, the North, the South, and the West, before we get to some of the key reform movements mentioned in Chapter 11. If we're talking about the chapters here, sectionalism is Chapter 9, the reform movements is Chapter 11, and then the immigration is kind of mentioned in both chapters. So first, talking about demographic shifts. Demographic refers to the people. What types of people are living in America at this point? And one of the things we have to keep in mind is there was huge population growth during the first half of the 1800s. It says down here the US population doubled every 25 years. We looked at a graph of this a week or two ago. It says by 1860 there were 33 states. Remember, there were originally 13. By 1860, there are 33 states, 31 million people. America was the fourth largest country in the world, and there were 43 cities of 20,000 people or more, which was relatively large back then. This was largely because of a high birth rate, but also mostly lots of immigration from Europe. So we'll explore that in a moment. And one of the reasons perhaps why there was so much immigration to the US is because of westward expansion. After the Louisiana Purchase, by Thomas Jefferson, the US has access to this massive tract of land in the Midwest and in the Great Plains. And so Americans begin to push west. We talked about some of the effects of this westward expansion, sometimes called ecological imperialism, because it's colonizing the land, destroying the land. So they exhaust the soil. Beavers and bisons nearly go extinct. And so we'll explore some of the effects on the West a little bit later. But for now, focusing on the immigrants who are coming, and they're mostly Irish and German. It says 35 million immigrants came from Europe between 1840 and 1900. And out of those 35 million, 4 million of them were Irish, 5 million of them were German. They were coming for a lot of reasons. There were a lot of things pushing them out of Europe, partially population growth in Europe. Europe can't get any more land, and so lots of people didn't have access to land as the population increased. There were also problems in Europe. In Ireland, the potato famine killed 2 million people. They'd become too reliant on potatoes. A potato virus wiped out their whole lively stock, or their whole livelihood essentially. So they fled to the Americas. And then in Germany, there were some attempts at revolution, 1830, 1848. That failed, so lots of people are fleeing that. But then there's also the prospect of freedom and opportunity in the US and access to land as well. So the Irish, there are 4 million Irish immigrants coming to America. They were generally quite poor. Remember, they're fleeing because of the potato famine. They are literally starving and desperate. They're too poor to buy land in the West, and so they oftentimes would move to the big cities, especially Boston and New York. They would oftentimes be low-skilled workers in these new factories. And they were oftentimes looked down on because they were oftentimes poor, and also because Irish Americans were mostly Catholic, whereas a lot of the rest of the US was Protestant. A lot of Irish were looked down upon. So when we're talking about Irish immigrants, we're talking about 4 million of them. They are escaping the potato famine from Ireland, and they mostly move to New York, Boston, the big cities. And they, again, are oftentimes low-skill working class. And they're looked down upon for their poverty and for their Catholic faith. It's kind of weird to look at this today because Catholics are accepted in the United States just like Protestants are. But 150 years ago, Catholics were seen as a quote unquote menace. In fact, up until JFK became president in 1960, 1961, there had never been a Catholic president. It was considered impossible. So the US had a history of Protestant presidents because of some of this anti-Catholic bias. Eventually, the Irish Americans are going to come to dominate local politics, especially in Boston and New York, and we'll explore that later. The Germans, on the other hand, 5 million Germans coming, they're more widely scattered. They oftentimes moved to the West and the Midwest and buy up farms. So they mostly are in the West and the Midwest, and they are farmers. You can see that they're oftentimes anti-war, anti-slavery because of what they're escaping from. They were escaping basically political revolution in Germany, so they want to avoid war. But because they're scattered throughout America, they have less political strength. Whereas, I should add here, for the Irish Americans, they become a political power. They control local politics, especially in Boston and New York. And we'll get to these ideas of political machines a little bit later on. This map shows us where the Irish are going. So you can see New York, Boston, New England, basically, but also some of the discrimination that they face. This is a newspaper advertisement that says no Irish need apply. So discrimination against Irish. And then for Germans, you can see where the Germans settled. So largely in the Dakotas, Michigan, Wisconsin, and then also scattered throughout the West as well. But because the German Americans are scattered much more, they don't have as much political power as the Irish. Now, again, it might seem weird to think about how the Irish Americans would be discriminated against because they're white. But back then, there was divisions within the white race, I guess, and there were certain white people that were considered superior. If you were German, if you were Anglo-Saxon, which means British, or if you were Nordic, which meant from Sweden or Denmark or something, you were considered superior, whereas there were more inferior white cultures, specifically the Irish. So again, it might seem weird to us today because white people are kind of seen as a large, just homogenous block. But 150 years ago, within white culture were all of these different subsets of white cultures, and the Irish were oftentimes seen as the bottom of that. Okay, so again, we talk about how the Germans are going to the Midwest, the Irish are going mostly to New England and the North. Now focusing on sectionalism. Sectionalism, the root of sectionalism is section. It's the different sections of the United States. So looking at the North, the South, and then the West, and some of the regions in each, some of the characteristics of each part. Let me move myself so we can see the map here. So the North refers to both New England and the middle colonies, kind of New York, Pennsylvania, and then some of the old Northwest, so Ohio to Minnesota, kind of this stretch right here. The North, New England, the Northeast, was largely urban. You can see 15% of the population was urban, which was quite high back then. And this is where we see the first factories, the first labor unions popping up. So the Northeast, again, was largely urban or more urban than other parts. We see lots of working class there in factories. And we also see more diversity there. Lots of immigrants coming to the North, especially the Irish, but also 250,000 free African Americans who are living in the North. So the Northeast is very industrial, factories. The Northwest, which is kind of this region, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, so west of Pennsylvania, they're a little bit more agricultural. They focus on corn and wheat. But because of the transportation revolution, the roads that connect places, the national road that connects Illinois to West Virginia, canals and railroads, New England and the Midwest are now connected. And so this connects the markets. Even though they're growing mostly wheat and corn over here, they're shipping it over to New England. So it's kind of like, to use a science term, a symbiotic relationship where New England and the Midwest are relying on each other. And because of this trade connected by the railroads, there's the rise of new cities, Chicago and Detroit, both along the lakes and both near railroads and things like that. So when we talk about the North, it is mostly industrial. Actually, no, it's not mostly. It's more industrial and more urban. We see lots of large urban centers. New York City, obviously, Boston, but also some of the new ones, Detroit and Chicago. New England is mostly factories. Lots of diversity with immigrants and those free African Americans. And then the Midwest, it's called here the agricultural Northwest, is more agricultural. But all of this is connected by roads, railroads, canals. And so there is a very strong economy, strong trade in the North. A lot of that, again, is because of the industrial centers. This map shows all of the factories, mostly in New England, but some in the Midwest as well. The South, on the other hand, is still largely agricultural with very few large cities. This map shows us which crops are the main ones, and you can see cotton is king, sometimes nicknamed King Cotton, because cotton was really what ran the Southern economy. Some tobacco, some rice, some sugar, but again, cotton is really the main crop. It says here cotton was 2/3 of American exports, and so the US is sending mostly cotton abroad, mostly to England, to the British textile mills as England is industrializing. But because agricultural trade is booming in the South, there was a huge demand, at least among white Southern plantation owners, to have more slaves. So the slave population increases from 1 million to 4 million from 1800 to 1860, but this is almost all from natural growth, slaves having children and then those children instantly becoming property or becoming slaves. The African slave trade was actually illegal at this point by 1800, and so all of this, or nearly all of this slave population growth was from just natural growth. And within the South, when Southern planters and Southern farmers would make profits, they oftentimes would not invest that in factories. Instead, they would invest that money in more slaves. And so it says here the South invested most of their money into slaves. They didn't have much money to try to industrialize. And so the South kind of focuses on the same old slaves working on plantation farms. The North is industrializing, modernizing. The South is not. So the South is still agricultural and slave-based. Cotton is king, that's the main crop there. And then some other characteristics that we see here, I should say cotton is 2/3 of exports. And then the slave population quadruples, goes from 1 million to 4 million. There's also a super rigid social hierarchy within the South. The aristocracy, the super big wealthy landowners, then the smaller farmers, then the landless whites, and then the enslaved Africans or African Americans at the bottom. So there's a rigid social hierarchy, even among whites. And again, just to clarify here, not industrialized. They are still very agricultural based. And then finally, the West. Now, the definition of the West keeps on changing as the US pushes farther and farther west. And so, I mean, you know, this part over here, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, that was the West at one point. After the Louisiana Purchase, this huge tract of land becomes part of the West. For us today, when we think of the West, we think of California, Oregon, Washington, and whatnot. So the definition of the West keeps on changing, but now generally it's kind of the land acquired by the Louisiana Purchase and west of that. As Americans are pushing west, they're forcing the Native Americans off of their land, sometimes by military force. We saw that with the Trail of Tears, sometimes with disease, and sometimes with overhunting, killing the beavers and the bison that the natives relied upon, and so they can't sustain themselves. And the West, the frontier, was really this mythical thing in American culture. It was seen as a fresh start. It was seen as a chance to really have a new beginning, to have a free life. But settler life in the West was incredibly hard, especially, well, not especially, for white people. And it was kind of like early colonial life, where you wouldn't have any big cities. You wouldn't have like trade between regions. You really got to grow and take care of everything that you need. So much shorter lifespans in the West, especially for women. And then lots of environmental damage. They would clear forests to make land for farms. They would exhaust the soil so that they couldn't grow more crops there, and then overhunting as well. That was that idea of ecological imperialism. So this is, when we talk about the West, it's the Louisiana Purchase land. And this represented a fresh start, new beginnings. We have natives forced off of their land, but we also have a very challenging life. It's kind of almost colonial, agricultural. So when we're talking about the different regions, the North is mostly or more industrial, more manufacturing. The South is more agricultural, and the West is kind of the frontier. And then remember, within the North, you have New England, which is those factories, manufacturing centers, and then the Midwest, which is more agricultural, but they're connected to that northern trade. Okay. Shifting gears quite a bit now to some of the reform movements of the first half of the 1800s. This is from chapter 11. And one of the first things that we see is a religious revival, sometimes, or not sometimes, called the Second Great Awakening. In the early 1800s, 75% or so of Americans still regularly attended church. That number is way lower today. And the like super strict Calvinist or Puritan beliefs had kind of faded away. You might remember Calvinists or Puritans. Those were the super strict Protestants that were like, absolutely no decorations on the churches, no gambling, no dancing. Sunday is all about rest and prayer. It starts to fade away a little bit. The American Revolution had also focused a lot on reason. And so people begin to move away from these super strict religious ideas. And that leads us to, deism was if you were an AP Euro last year, you might remember learning about the Enlightenment. Deism was kind of like the religion of the Enlightenment. It was the idea that God created the world, but then kind of stepped back. He gave us all the tools that we needed. He gave us reason. He gave us free will. He created this perfect world. And so this was the idea that, God created this world, but we have free will, which was really empowering for people. So the Second Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening, you might remember, was back in the 1730s. That was with Jonathan Edwards, who was the famous pastor back then. And that was all about super fiery, passionate preachers. It was all about people having a direct access to God, this super emotional religion. The Second Great Awakening is somewhat similar, but it's much more about the masses. It's much more about the masses having access to religion and to the church. So we see mass religious meetings, super large church sessions, or traveling church caravans, essentially, that would give big sermons and things like that. This boosted church membership. Lots of people converted to normally Protestant faiths. And it focused mostly on emotion, kind of like the First Great Awakening did, and kind of like it also focused on your personal connection and your personal conversion to be a better Christian. And many of the people who were targeted were middle-class women. Middle-class women saw religion through the Second Great Awakening as a chance to have a more active role in society, to become kind of religious leaders in their community. Now, this was largely in the South and in the West. These were mostly poorer regions, so they were kind of attracted to the draw of religion, and also less educated. They might not have read about the scientific revolution or the ideas of Darwin, and so they might be more interested in these religious ideas. So when we talk about the reform movements, the Second Great Awakening, this is a religious revival in the early 1800s. It is especially in the South and the West. This allows middle-class white women to gain an active role in society. And it really focuses on personal connections to God, emotions, and just in general, we see an increase in church membership. So the nation becomes more religious, I suppose. Some paintings here showing these traveling sermons who would go from town to town and give these big fiery speeches, oftentimes in the woods just outside of town, to spread their word and to get more converts. Education is another one of the big reform movements here, and this is public education. Public education meaning it's funded by the government or funded by our tax dollars. Public education begins to emerge 1825 to 1850. If you were in AP Euro last year, you might remember that Napoleon Bonaparte in France, he popularized the idea of state-run high schools. So this is kind of continuing that trend. Now, a lot of conservatives and wealthy were against public education because it was mostly for the poor, because the wealthy could afford to have an education. But once all men got the vote, once there was universal male suffrage, which happens right around 1828, 1832, right when Andrew Jackson becomes president, once all men get the vote, people begin to realize, well, education is super important. If every person has a vote, we got to make sure that they're being responsible with their vote. We've got to avoid that ignorant rabble. And so we begin to see state-run public schools. Now, these first schools were not great. They focused on the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. I know that's not R's, but that's how it was called back then. This was only for white people. And there begins to be some leaders who begin to call for a reformed public education. Horace Mann, who's kind of the father of public education in America, he calls for better schools, better teachers, and better curriculum. And Noah Webster, who you might know from Merriam and Webster, the dictionary, he creates textbooks to promote patriotism, to tell the American story. Again, you might remember if you were in AP Euro last year, Napoleon Bonaparte did the same thing. He used his public-run schools to inspire French nationalism, to get a certain message across. Same thing here. So actually, there's one more slide here, so then I'll add some notes. Universities also start to pop up. And these are both small, religious, liberal arts universities that focused very specifically on traditional curriculum, Latin, Greek, math, and philosophy. But then we also have the first public state-sponsored universities in the South, I should add. There had been universities in New England, the Ivies like Harvard, since the 1700s. So North Carolina, University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, University of Virginia as well. The first public state-sponsored universities in the South. And they're focusing on, okay, Latin, Greek, math, philosophy as well, but also on the sciences and on modern languages, histories, the humanities, if you will. Now, this education was still pretty much exclusively for men. The woman's role, the woman's sphere was still considered to be in the household. There was one college called Oberlin College that did open their doors to all, well, not all, men and women, whites and blacks. But they took a lot of criticism. And some people said, well, if they're educating blacks, if they're educating women, they'll be educating cows next. So you can see both sexism and racism built into perceptions around who should get an education. Back then, it was only white men that thought they should get that education. And then Thomas Jefferson, who helped to create the University of Virginia, famously said, "This institution, UVA, or the University of Virginia, of my native state, the hobby of my old age, will be based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind to explore and to expose every subject susceptible of its contemplation." So Thomas Jefferson, again, who helps found UVA, or University of Virginia, focusing on the humanities, not just narrow traditional curriculum, but exploring all sorts of ideas. Okay, I think that's it for education, yep. So let's add some details here for education. We have the first state-run public schools. And this is after universal male suffrage. There is a need to educate all men. But again, this was mostly or only for white men. And there are some early pushes. So there are attempts to reform schools by having better schools, better curriculum, but also on teaching the sciences, the humanities, not just Latin, Greek, and things like that. So again, both public schools and, I should add, universities. Okay, now some other reform movements, and these reform movements are a direct result of the Second Great Awakening. As the Second Great Awakening leads to a religious revival, that kind of inspires reformers to fight for a better society, to fight for a more perfect society, which was the old Puritan dream. Remember, women were some of the most active members of the Second Great Awakening. They had an active role in the church. And so women were oftentimes the most active reformers. And this is a new opportunity for women to have a more active role, not just in the church, but in society as well. So some of the general things that they fought for getting rid of imprisoning people because of debt, which was just another form of slavery, essentially. They softened some criminal codes. It was the idea that prisons should reform and not just punish. This is still an issue that we're debating today. And then they tried to improve conditions for the mentally ill, sanitariums or insane asylums, I suppose. Trying to take care of the mentally ill. Again, a lot of this was inspired by the Second Great Awakening, trying to make a better society, but it's also inspired by the Enlightenment, which was in the late 1700s, of trying to use science and reason to make a better society. One of the reform movements was Prohibition, which is basically getting rid of alcohol. And so the American Temperance Society, made in 1826, was all about trying to have moderation or self-control, especially in drinking. And so we begin to see some states begin to experiment with prohibition, banning alcohol. Maine prohibited the manufacturing and sale of liquor in 1851. Some other states joined as well, but these laws never really took root. They weren't permanent. We will eventually see prohibition taken up again in the early 1900s. And I suppose it makes some sense why women would maybe lead the charge here, because I mean, their husbands are the ones who are getting drunk and coming home and being God knows what. So it makes perhaps some sense why women might be leading the charge against alcohol, against or for prohibition. So again, prohibition, we have, there are attempts to ban alcohol. Some early laws, especially in Maine, but there's no like permanent effect yet. And then women's rights as well. Again, women are the most active reformers because they had that central role in the Second Great Awakening. And this is kind of their sphere, if you will. As the market economy, which remember the market economy was the increased economic growth during the 1800s because of new inventions like the cotton gin and new transportation systems like canals and roads. The market economy was dividing men and women into certain roles. Men were supposed to be the workers, and women were seen as weak, but also maybe more artistic and moral. This was called sometimes the cult of domesticity, that women have a role. Now that role might be at home, but because women are more spiritually and morally superior, they have a role to teach our children to keep America moral. And so again, that traditional role in home was celebrated. And so I'm gonna actually add here, I'm gonna add another row that talks about the role of women here. So I'm gonna say here that women were most active in reform movements. And that is because they were inspired by the Second Great Awakening and because they were seen as morally superior. So it's kind of their realm, if you will. And so we see some of the earlier efforts to get the vote for the woman. You might remember Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote in England in 1793, Vindication of the Rights of Women, arguing that women should have the vote as well. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton are continuing that fight for women's rights in the United States. Again, fighting for the vote for women. So we have Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton fight for the vote for women, women's suffrage. And one of the earliest efforts to try to gain the vote for women was the Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, or the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 in New York. Elizabeth Cady Stanton kicked things off with the Declaration of Sentiments, kind of like the Declaration of Independence, that said not only are all men equal, but all men and women are created equal. And it was at the Seneca Falls Convention that women formally launched their effort to get the vote. So this really launched the modern women's rights movement that is frankly still being fought for today. So Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the Seneca Falls Convention fighting for vote and for the equality. But I do need to add a super important clarification. This is only for white women. A lot of people recently have kind of been uncovering some of the writings of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they were very adamant. Only white women should get the vote. They were actually quite racist in their judgments of Black women, saying that they do not deserve the vote. And so with any hero of American history, or really with any celebrated person at all, these two leaders of the women's rights movement were imperfect because they're human beings. They were fighting only for the vote for white women and very intentionally ignoring Black women. And so to wrap up at least the reform movement part, chapter 11, the Second Great Awakening is this religious revival that inspires lots of Americans to fight for a more perfect society, especially women. So women take a much more active role in society, trying to fight for things like better education, temperance, banning alcohol, and then women's rights as well. And so I'm just gonna add one more thing on the Second Great Awakening here. I'm gonna say that this inspires people to fight for a better society, and this leads to those reform movements. So again, we have our reform movements, pause if you need to. And then we have our kind of regional differences between the North, the South, and the West, pause there if you need to.